In today's video, we'll be talking about how you can convince your parents into doing something that you think is healthy for them, but they aren't ready to do it. Let's see. Hello, good people of the internet. Welcome to another episode of Ask a Human, Not an AI with Chetan Naran. Today's question, which is another anonymous one, is how to make your parents get into a reading habit or getting them at least to not watch news a lot. Maybe it is something which I don't want and it pisses me off because I don't want to consume those things because of the negativity there. I hope I was clear in explaining. Yes, you were. When I first read this question, it made me think a lot because I think this is a common issue that a lot of people in my age group face, where we think we understand something better than our parents and it concerns their lives. And when we want to convince them from our viewpoint, we find there to be this massive bridge that we have to cross that somehow almost none of us are able to cross. I have faced this personally myself. I face this personally myself even now. So when I first read your question, I just started jotting down a few points and I ended up jotting down five key points that I wanted to talk about with regards to this question. So let's get into them one after the other. Point number one that I would talk about in this regard is a cautionary thing for the questioner, which is do not try to be a therapist for your parents. It never works. It's just the dynamic of that whole relationship. I think that's why you cannot even try to be a counselor or a therapist to your parents. If I was talking to you in Hindi, I would have said that your parents, whenever you try to give them a serious life advice or something, it's almost obvious that the first thing in their mind would be, "तू सिखाएगा अब, इतना बड़ा हो गया है." Whoever did not get that, it's just basically that you're never grown up enough for your parents. You're never wise enough for your parents, and it'll always be this dynamic that you cannot give a serious life advice to your parents and expect them to consider it seriously directly. It almost never works, let's just say. In fact, this reminds me of this one beautiful quote from, I think, Ramdas. He said something like, if you think you are enlightened, go spend a weekend with your family. That is exactly what he meant. Just the dynamic of the relationship you have with your family, even with your siblings for that matter, it just doesn't work like that. It just doesn't work with someone else asking, with you asking an advice or giving an advice to someone else. So you will be much better off if you can to arrange for the same advice to be given to your parents from someone else, maybe one of their friends, maybe one of your friends or your friends parents, etc. However you want to arrange it, maybe even a third person therapist or a counselor, but the same advice given from you versus the same words spoken by someone else, it's going to have a lot more different impact. So keep that in mind. My second advice to you would be, do not try to change them forcefully. As much as we kids want ourselves to be independent these days, we should assume for our parents also that they want to be independent too. So if you think something is better for them and you try to force them into doing something or try to convince them forcefully into doing something, they might relent, they might do it, but they will not really be convinced. So do not try to change your parents forcefully. Assume the same independence that you want for yourself, assume the same for your parents too. So try to convince them, try to have them inculcate healthy habits, like you do not want them to consume negative news. I totally relate to that. But do not try to force them into changing their habit, their daily routine, etc. Try it somehow with a detached expectation of the outcome. Something which the Bhagavad Gita would suggest: karm kar, phal ki chinta mat kar. Do the deed, but do not worry about the results. Because the end result is A, it's not in your control, and B, the end result concerns a separate person, a separate human being altogether. So you should not really be going into it with the perspective of, I'm going to forcefully try to convince my parents and change them. Point number three, and perhaps the most important one, is do not try to convince them only over arguments. What I mean is, see, whenever you try to do something of this sort, trying to convince your parents into doing something that they don't really want to do, I'm sure it'll, on a lot of occasions, it'll lead to an argument with your parents trying to take up their stand and you taking your stand, and these are now two different sides. And it has led into sometimes a full blown argument, sometimes maybe a little argument. Point number one would be, in an argument, try to back off. and talk about that situation when emotions have calmed down. But I also want to say that, let's say, with regards to what you're talking about, let's say your dad watches news a lot and you want to convince him to not watch the news. If you do that while he's watching the news and that leads to an argument, maybe he relents and he turns off the news, or maybe turns on some other channel, whatever. But do you really think that convinces him that this is not good for him? It almost always is that a person convinced in an argument to do something that he didn't really want to do is a person not convinced at all. And therefore, what I mean to say is, do not just bring these points up when the situation leads to a heated argument. Maybe bring this point up also when you guys are in a good mood. Maybe when you guys are chatting up about something else entirely. And if you really think that what you want to convince your parents about is healthier for them, try to bring up those points into your conversations away from those situations that lead to arguments too. Because this is very important. Whenever you get into an argument, the dynamic of our relationships with our parents and our siblings and our friends may be that one or the other person relents and simply does what the other person wants him to do at that moment, without really being convinced of the utility of what you were trying to convince exactly. So this is what I would say: do not try to convince your parents only over arguments. Try to bring this healthier point up also when you guys are having maybe a more healthier conversation, maybe you guys are in a light mood, etc. Point number 4 would be to always, above all, come from a place of understanding and love and compassion. What I mean is, if you are a self aware person, if you have realized and thought about your own biases and your own thoughts, you realize that even after having realized all of them, it's very hard to change. It's very hard to change your ideas and opinions and ways of going about things that are almost hard coded into how you act. And therefore, see, that is when you have realized yourself that you want to change. In this situation that you're talking about, it's not your dad or your mom who wants to change, it's you who want to change them. And therefore it's twice as hard. It's hard for you and it's harder for them. So what I mean is, you need to always come from a place of understanding that it's anyway hard for a person to change, and it's twice as hard when you do not really realize that you need to change. So above all, come from a place of this understanding and compassion and love, and try not to force your parents into arguments all the time. And the fifth and final point is that try to convince your parents not only with your words but also with your actions, especially with your actions. What I mean is, talk about your own case. You want your dad or your mom to not watch news consistently because of all the negativity that's there. Fair enough, fair point. But if you yourself do not watch the news, but your Instagram feed or your YouTube feed is full of content that makes you negative about the government, the society, the older generations, the other gender, etc., and you yourself do not radiate any positivity at all in your household, do you really think your parents would be convinced that if they stop watching the news, they will not be receiving anything negative? That's what I mean. Show your parents with your actions as well as with your words that what you're saying is actually true. And this applies to countless other dimensions. It's the same way with children. If you want to convince your children to maybe read books or maybe meditate for that matter, just shouting at them or telling them to do that may get them to do it once a while. But if you really want to do them, if you really want them to do it in the form of a regular habit, in the form of a practice, you would have to firstly do it yourself, read books and meditate regularly, and also show it in your actions that this is how this is helping me. This is how reading books or meditating on a regular basis is helping out with how I react to situations, how I perceive situations, etc. And believe me, if you show it in your actions, children and other human beings as well pick up those cues. You do not really have to literally tell everything to everyone all the time. So, this is very important. I'll reiterate: show and convince your parents not only with your words but also with your actions. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope you found this useful. If you have any such question for yourself, for your friends, for your family, for your siblings, whoever, check out my website, check out the Ask a Human Not an AI page, and send across your questions. I'll see you in the playground the next time. Until next time, peace out.